right, we're back after our break and we're just finishing up some Q&A and Member Sanchez has a question.
Hi, Lori. Thank you for your presentation. My question just has to do with the chronic absence task force and the professional development that was in tandem with attendance works. So you mentioned that there were 3 90-minute sessions that were provided. This was by invitation only. Are you planning on continuing that? Is that a part of the recommendation of the task force to maybe continue that work? And then in between those 3 90-minute sessions, was there continued maybe follow-up or support?
Absolutely happy to answer that question. So yes, there was in between follow-up support, and we actually are still in contact with those individuals who took part in that training. We are working very closely with Attendance Works on what I will refer to as sort of a deeper dive with some of those programs in order to dig a little deeper into those 3 bucket items you saw with the recommendations about the actionable data, about the messaging, and about the implementation. And can you remind me what your very first question was?
I was going to ask you about with that PD, the Attendance Works PD. I wanted to also ask you about how many were invited and how many LEAs also attended.
Absolutely. So in terms of the LEAs who were invited, so we did the invitation, and then we sort of opened it up a little bit statewide to those that we knew were experiencing higher levels of chronic absence. For those that we reached out individually to extend an invitation, we had 100% response rate on that. And we really leaned into their data elements for that. We also, I'm going to go back to our partnership with Helios and also our partnership with Valley of the Sun United Way, who is deploying what they're referring to as Project SAM, which is looking at attendance, supporting attendance across Maricopa County, is they're receiving some coaching supports and services. And so all of those individuals who had that very high elevated chronic absence rate, they came to our particular training, and then they're also receiving some follow-up coaching underneath the Project SAM umbrella. So it very much is this braided approach to how do we reach out to those that we notice have high levels of chronic absence. The trainings offered through Attendance Works, I will say, are really about capacity building. Think of it in terms of like a 100-level college course. We're beginning to thread the needle for them and then making them aware of different follow-up supports that are available to them, some of them going on with the work underneath Project SAM, and then some of them we are in contact with right now about other topics for taking that deeper dive that they're asking for.
Thank you. That answered my first question.
Absolutely.
Just to follow up on that though, because I think part of your question was about continuing those, the chronic absence, peer learning exchange, and PD was relief dollar funded. So that will be ending and hopefully demonstrating some results that maybe there's continued funding available in some way, shape, or form. And then Project SAM, the student attendance, supporting student attendance across Maricopa, is a grant funded project to the Valley of the Sun United Way. So there's no guarantee that that can continue unless there is funding provided.
Thank you.
I did have a question for you. You talked about like the science of reading having, and I know teachers have been trained on the science of reading, and we've been, you guys, the state has been providing that training and things. But then you also talked, it said access to high quality early learning. And I was just wondering kind of like what has been done there to ensure that there is access to that high quality early learning across the state.
So in terms of how chronic absence fits into the shared priorities, or what's being done to increase access to high quality learning in the state? Just a clarifying piece.
I guess I'm just wondering, because it kind of ties in with absenteeism. If there's, if there's a program that the kids are wanting to attend, and then that, increases their, coming to school, I guess, is what I was wondering about, how, because it just said in there, access to high quality learning. And I just was confused on like, what you mean by that, I guess. Like,
Absolutely. So access to high quality early learning is it's one of the 4 shared strategic priorities that Read On Arizona has. And so underneath that umbrella, it's how are we, one of 2 things. So how are we ensuring that those programs that are currently in existence are opting into a quality pathway, whether that be going through the state's QRS system, being nationally accredited, being overseen by the Department of Ed, or being a Head Start program. And so when we think about chronic absence in those spaces, what I can share with you is outside of Head Start having provisions in place to address chronic absence is that those programs who are currently being overseen by the Arizona Department of Education do a data collection point for those that are receiving state funding, whether that's the high quality early learning or whether or not that's the preschool development grant. They have embedded into their data collection metrics a piece on attendance and chronic absence so that they're addressing it in that space separate of the Head Start space. So just thinking about how that is weaved in there. And then I would be remiss if I didn't point out that in terms of school readiness, a number of our Head Start programs and our programs being operated by the Arizona Department of Education Early Childhood are weaving into their school readiness pieces a portion for parents that talks about the importance of attending early on in the preschool space and what that attendance looks like in kindergarten as well, so that we're doing that continuity of messaging and services across that birth through 5, kindergarten to K-3 and beyond continuum.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members, and just at a high level, the one thing I would add, this maybe address Member Vaughn's question, is there has been a big focus on access to high quality early learning in that space. And over the last couple of years, the Department of Ed has partnered with Department of Economic Security and other folks to bring over $100 million in funding through high quality early learning grants, the preschool development B5 grant, to ensure that. So just, I don't know if, Member Vaughn, if your question was more general of like, you know, where is this focus, but there's quite a bit of focus in that space as well. And Lori, I don't, if you may know this off the top of your head, I'm assuming you probably do. What percentage of kids in Arizona have access to high quality learning in that environment?
27% of 3 and 4-year-olds have access to high quality preschool opportunities in the state of Arizona.
Just a quick, I'm sorry,
No problem.
Chair Clark. Do you know how that number compares nationally, just out of curiosity?
So how that number, so it's we're not comparing necessarily apples to apples. So what I will tell you is from a national perspective that 48% of preschool age children have access to preschool programming. How they define quality varies from state to state because of access to resources. And so what we do know is that we have from a statewide perspective, what I will refer to as an early learning gap of about 25%, meaning all children who potentially need care do not currently have access to it. When we are defining quality in our state, only 27% of preschool age children have access to quality early learning settings. And just as a reminder for those early learning settings, that is all preschool programs overseen by the Department of Ed. That is all Head Start programs. That is all programs that are 3 to 5 star rated in the Quality First program. And that is all programs that are nationally accredited. And the reason I know the percent of the number is that we do the calculation for the state for the Arizona Progress Meter.
All right. Thank you, Lori. That was a great presentation. And members, again, thank you for your great questions, and members that are on virtually. Awesome questions. So we are, now that we have learned more about the Arizona data around chronic absence, and we thought it would be important for the subcommittee to hear from an Arizona district that is having success in addressing chronic absence. For this district spotlight, we have with us virtually Dr. Scott Hagerman, the superintendent of the Tonka Verde Unified School District. So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Hagerman.
Thank you. So I don't, can you see presentations at this point, or how's it going technology wise?
So Dr. Hagerman, it's Sean. On YouTube, they're seeing the presentation. Our members who are joining us virtually are seeing the presentation. We're not actually seeing it in the boardroom. However, we do have your presentation printed out. So as you move through, if you could say like slide 1, slide 2, that would probably just help folks.
I will do that. So, so I am the proud superintendent of the Tanque Verde School District. Our district has about 2,200 kids, two K-6s, junior high and a high school. And so we had, Terry at one point a couple of years ago had reached out because they were looking at our data related to reading and absenteeisms and seeing some interesting increases and wanted to hear more. This presentation initially was at the Helios kind of conference when we looked at attendance. And then I've added some additional slides to just talk about how we keep adjusting and trying to find the best ways in the kind of work on these issues. I do think the attendance works, that one slide that you guys kind of looked at and talked towards is a really good model, looking at the barriers, looking at the ways kids are invited or kind of pushed away in the culture. How do we engage kids? And for us, we'll talk mostly academically and also extracurricularly. And then the kind of misconceptions, especially post-pandemic, that we're trying to kind of compete and kind of go against. So I'm going to go to slide 3 now. So I started in 2017. At that point, we were above average, but there was a downward slope and there was lack of like systematic approach to student learning. And so all of our model that we started with really focuses on academic engagement and having supporting systems that help student learning. And we kind of have the theory that, just like you guys said, attendance affects learning, but if kids don't feel successful, it affects their attendance. So there's this kind of ongoing cycle that you have to attack. So we went after having a clear system of how do we support student learning? So we implemented a professional learning community model that comes out of Solution Tree, out of the work of Rick DeFord and Bob Aker. So we'll go to the next slide. And so what collaboration for us means is that all educators are on a team. In elementary, it's by grade level. They're meeting at least weekly. In addition, they get a release days quarterly. And then during the summertime, they get paid release time or paid days to come in to set up stuff. We have a weekly protocol. So weekly, they're looking at student work and they're looking at what students are learning. Those release days are to set up their units, to kind of map out what comes next. And so week to week, we're looking at where kids are at and figuring out how do we adjust. And then we use these bigger chunks of time to sort of set up what comes next. And the next slide is just a quote I just want to always look at from Michael Folan, who talks about the fact that we use terms and sometimes we use the terms, but the concepts underneath it didn't travel. So there's a lot of people who say they have professional learning communities, but the actions that the teams take aren't embedded in the actions that will really have impact on student learning. And so for us, we constantly be really clear about what the teams do when they meet. What does that actually look like? Are we actually getting impact from that work? And so it's just really super important. So the underlying of everything we do in Tanque Verde is about collaboration. And how do we work together as a teams? How do we work across teams? How do we work across schools? I think the reason that both Tanque Verde Elementary and ACES, you'll see that the results that they've had and how similar it is because there's a kind of a cross-school approach to how they collaborate and how they work together. Now, the next slide is kind of my version of Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry's model around engagement out of their work called Engagement by Design. Coming out of kind of going into 21-22, there was so much talk about achievement gaps. And I just was very concerned that all of the things being suggested were going to be not remarkably engaging, will be mildly aversive. And all the things that we engage kids and bring kids to skill and support their learning, we were going to do things that would be opposite of that. And so this model really talked to us because it talked to the things that if we lean into, we could connect with kids. And the first thing is, what degree are we really thinking about making classrooms inviting and building relationships with kids and making sure that there's not kids out there that have no adult that they have a connection with. The next thing is trying to make our instruction as clear as possible, that kids know what exactly is the learning target we're learning today, why is it relevant, and what does success look like. And then the final thing is to work on the level of challenge. And then John Hattie says you always want things that are not too hard, but not too boring. And so trying kind of kid by kid in a differentiated way to kind of make work that is meaningful for them. So we continue to work on that, but that was in the pandemic when we really leaned into this and thinking really a lot about this area. So go to the next slide. Another element that was during the pandemic really important, and it's still in a place, was trying to ensure access. So if our theory is kids who don't come to school don't learn at the same rate, but then if they're not successful, that creates the next absence. What can we do that even if a kid's not in school, that they know what happened today? They can try to keep them connected to their learning. So even if there is an attendance issue, how do we keep them connected, and how do we so that when they come back in, they're not like completely lost, or they like don't feel how to like get back connected with what's going on. So I think at this point, almost all of our teachers are Google educated certified. So we're a Google district. And so like knowing the tools of how to use Google Classroom, how to use all the Google tools to kind of set up the support systems and ways to kind of communicate both with kids and parents using those tools. We increased the number of devices we had. We were probably about a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, like 3 kids for every device. And we've gone to 1-to-1. And then we used a combination of E-rate and bonds to replace our entire network. Our network was over 10 years old and really just piecemealed together. So that became a really important component during the pandemic. So the next slide gives you kind of our progress meter data from 2018. And then the second slide gives it what it looked like in 2022. So you can see how we made it. And the things that are interesting is that the increases across both schools, but then they became really kind of connected because the processes they were using were fairly similar and they were getting positive results. So the last slide I have is, oh no, I guess I have 2 more slides. The one thing is that the other thing that came out is that in Harvard and Stanford's educational recovery scorecard, our school district was one of only like 3% that showed gains throughout the pandemic, both in ELA and in math. And so there was like learning losses statewide, our kids were in fact making gains during the pandemic. And I think it has to do with how engaging, how clear we were getting about what we want kids to learn, and how do we try to maintain access. So my last slide is to talk about since then. And then also I'm going to kind of blend in those 4 categories and talk about like, how do we approach barriers? How do we approach kind of moments when kids don't feel supported or invited to school? How do we do engagement and misconceptions? So we have the same things that you see in that data. We continue to have to fight kind of attendance issues. I feel there's a lot on the barrier and misconception side that we're having to work with now. There's people that during the pandemic don't know when, like after the pandemic, don't know when or when not to come to school because their illnesses, or a belief that missing a day or here or there has kind of their kind of perception has changed. So like fighting that misconception battle has been challenging for us. And that might be a really nice space that having statewide credibility, trying to make that kind of narrative and do that messaging would be super supportive. Since 2022, we really continue to work on formative assessment of looking at where exactly a kid is, where each kid is every week, and making adjustments and responding to that. We're the last year and going into next year, we've done a lot of work on proficiency scales, which are scales that give you really clear ideas of why a kid is not at the level you want them to be. So it gives you much clearer ideas of how to respond. We've embedded win time, which is what you need time, 45 minutes, 4 times a week across every grade level. We added functional phonics, which is a system from the University of Minnesota that's based on letters training, which all our staff is getting, which has been really helpful. And we use an approach called respect, affirmation, and inclusion, initially with all staff members, but now we're working with our athletics programs, with our clubs, of how do we make sure that kids are respected, affirmed, and included. And now this is where I kind of go off script. In terms of barriers, we definitely see an increase of kids reporting anxiety. So we have an organization we work with that we can hand them off to, or the parents can call for resources that they'll help find medical appointments, which are profoundly difficult. If you ever try to get an appointment for an 8-year-old with anxiety issues, can be very challenging. So having an organization that sort of helps navigate and helps parents kind of go through those barriers has been very helpful for us. The other thing we're really working on right now is thinking about how to get kids invested in extracurricular activities. There's some research that really interested me around if a kid in junior high is in an extracurricular activity, their likelihood of graduating is just astronomically more positive. So how can we reduce barriers? How can we increase opportunities to get kids connected in their learning, but then connected to something that interests them kind of outside of like the reading, writing, and math stuff? So there's like multiple reasons why you're coming to school. So that is an area that we're really working on right now as we continue to work on how do we promote affirmation and inclusion in schools, kind of like I said, working at the club levels and the athletic levels, make sure our athletes kind of are leaders both in the school in terms of learning, but also in terms of creating a culture of supporting all kids. I'm only guess the last thing I would say before any kind of questions is the way I think how I think about how we create this model is those 4 areas that attendance work talked about is like we're trying to create a menu of supports. And it might be that different kids have different reasons, but if we're creating supports in those 4 areas, we're creating a system that can pick up ways of helping them. And then those layers of tiered support of this is the things we do for all kids. Here's kids that have a targeted tier 2 kind of support. And then here's some kids that need some really all hands on deck systematic tier 3 support is kind of how we approach that. And we have these things that are ongoing. How we approach learning is how we do things, but we continue to try to find ways to blend in new ideas and new things, because sometimes things that worked a couple of years ago, like around being respective or having a positive culture, might get old and they need something new and kind of freshened up. So like, let's really focus on extracurriculars. So there's like things we do systematically and consistently, and then things we try to blend in new and kind of change things up to kind of find things that connect with kids in the moment. So with that, I'm open to any questions you guys have.
Thank you, Dr. Hagerman. That was a great example of local work and what can be done to address this issue. I'm looking at committee members to see if anyone has, yes, Heather, Member Overton.
Thanks for being here and congratulations on your successes. One thing that I had brought up, excuse me, one thing I had brought up last time in our meeting was the difference between that tier 2 support when it comes to the move on when reading law and then what you're calling win time. Is there a difference between those two? Are you meeting the needs of the move on when reading RTI supports in addition to doing this win time?
So win time, it sort of fits in a tier 2. So imagine your team meeting gets done. You have a group of kids that have different learning targets they need, and maybe just a group of kids that can extend and enrich. We're doing those direct this week's meeting. We're going to address that. We in addition have reading specialists who are doing more kind of like really top to bottom building and going back and filling gaps. And so the win time is more directly responding to learning right now to keep kids moving and going. And then we have additional time where we're pulling kids out that doing kind of more kind of top to bottom. We use Wilson. So we might be using a Wilson program in that tier 3, a kind of reading support. Does that help a little bit? So, I mean, how we would see tier 2 is responding to things that we're learning right now to get them to success. And we look at tier 3 as like there's gaps that they need to fill in, and we're using tier 3 to fill in gaps, kind of those bigger like leaps of learning.
That sounds great. It would be great to possibly see maybe the structure of how your K-3 literacy blocks are set up in order to make sure that both of those are accounted for, because that's best practice. And that's something that I know districts have trouble getting to.
So, I mean, one thing scheduling wise is that we do our literacy blocks and our win time so that they don't happen at the same level at any grade level, so that we can push everybody else from like, so everyone's going to be all hands on deck. We're going to push the reading specialist, the gifted teacher, some special ed teachers into the gifted like kindergarten block, and then they can move up to 2nd grade and 3rd grade, as opposed to having everyone doing literacy at the same time. We're kind of doing it by grade level. Tier 3 is always a challenge. It's just, I mean, we're trying to make sure that kids are never taken out for special ed support or Tier 3 support in core areas, but it's always a profound issue, and you always have to watch schedule creep, where you start the year and you have it set up that no one's missing core stuff, and all of a sudden you look at the schedule in January and it's like, hey, when did that change? That kid can't miss math to get this reading support. They have to be able to get both. And so you have to, so we set the schedule up kind of that way, and then we have to constant monitor so that schedules don't get adjusted along the way.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I'd have one more because I just am, this is
no.
very exciting that you have figured this out. When it comes to students who are receiving their EL support, is that happening outside of this time as well, or are you counting that as their Tier 3 time?
So for us, we don't have enough kids in EL support that our percentage of ELLs is extremely small. So it's much more the special ed supports that we're trying to navigate, or it's usually like OT and speech that I find the most challenging. But the other thing I guess we're also looking at is in terms of goals around special ed is as we get better with proficiency scales and better with like what's the most essential thing by grade level, trying to ensure that special ed services are kind of mapped to that, as opposed to sometimes you have theoretical goals that you just tend to use repeatedly, as opposed to what's most critical for third grade, what's most critical for fourth grade, and trying to get services that are kind of in coordination with other things going on. The other part of that is our Director of Student Services is overseeing both Title I services and special ed, so that there's not a continuum switch for Title I looks like this and special ed is totally different and looks like that. Those services need to kind of work in relation to each other.
Thank you very much.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the committee. Dr. Hagerman, I think you explained it. I was just going to say that what it seems like from your explanation is the win time is really sort of every kid, and it's not just literacy. It could be math, it could be executive function, it could be emotional, where the other pieces related to things like literacy, those are separate from the win time. Is that correct?
Yeah, you got it. So the win time is kind of a Tier 2 support, but it's kind of open season for that grade level team sees as the most immediate need at the moment. And usually it blends mostly between math and reading. And the primary levels, they probably live in literacy a little bit more than math. And as it gets older, it gets a little more spread out.
Dr. Hagerman, the results of the work that you've done here are incredible, and I'm so appreciative of your time to share this with us. I had two specific questions for you. One is, it seems to me like your sort of headline on tackling chronic absenteeism is really an academic one. Is that like an accurate statement? Like, you're not going after specifically chronic absenteeism, you're going after like improving the content and improving the Tier 1 instruction that your teachers are delivering.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely believe that. I kind of like the research says if kids feel like they're successful, that helps so many things. So how do we help kids feel successful academically in what they do? I do think as we go along, the elements of like engaging them in other aspects of school and kind of having systems to address barriers is a thing. But I feel like if you make those all separate initiatives, I think everything gets fragmented and people feel like here's another thing and another thing. But if we frame it all together, this is how we help kids learn, it doesn't feel as fragmented. So I think my answer would be that yes, and that we use the learning as like the all-encompassing method of this is how we do stuff, and then we should provide the supports within that.
Yep, no, it's incredible. I think my second question would be, another piece that I heard you talk a lot about is sort of the weekly responsiveness to data and how your teachers are using data to drive instructional decisions. Can you talk a little bit more about both the assessments that you're using and that sort of weekly data structure to ensure that your teachers are both being able to be responsive from the chronic absenteeism perspective, but also clearly from the academic perspective to drive results?
Cool. So one thing I did initially, and it's in the case study, but I don't think it was in the presentation as much, is that the district did a lot of benchmark data that no one looked at or utilized. And so it became really compliance oriented. So we focused much more on 3 to 5 question formative assessments by learning target. And so what staff are bringing in are really short formative data. And now it's even kind of broken out in learning targets based on proficiency scales. We're using School City now just because it offers a lot of different ways to ask similar questions and by target and by standard, where if you sometimes write your own questions, you have a tendency to write the same style of question every single time, and you don't necessarily see how adaptive the kids' learning is to different kinds of questions. And then the weekly protocol, it always starts off with what did the kids learn last week? What strategies are working best? And then what do we do now? And now what it used to be is the protocol would break out of who's far below, who's close, and who's kind of got it. And now it's moving towards by target. Here's a group of kids that need this target versus this target versus that target. And so we're trying, and so then that sort of starts setting up the win time groups where instead of saying, here's a group of kids that are low, and we don't necessarily know why, here's a group of kids that need this, here's a group of kids that need that, here's the kids that can be extended that way. So it's starting to, every single week, we're setting up those like subgroups and what exactly is the area to focus on for each of the subgroups.
That's great. Thank you.
We're having a moment of envy just with your leadership and your team's ability to implement and yeah, I hope you can see the faces of members. And we're very excited for the work that you've done. Member Durden has a question for you.
Thank you. And also congratulations. This is amazing. I did have a question. Can you briefly tell us what your data analysis protocol would look like? Because I know you're not doing PLC light, you're really digging into it. So when your teachers get together to look at that data, I'm thinking of the benchmark data now.
Yeah.
How does that look? What do you all do?
So our biggest focus is by standard, by student. And so we try to avoid looking at the average score of the whole, like, you know, how many kids are at this level or that level, as opposed to like what kids, like, let's break down the standards and go at that level. So it's really kind of and then from there, one of the things that one of the groups is doing, and we're getting ready to do a training where we kind of grab cool things that teams are doing, is they're embedding questions that all kids had problems with, putting the specific question in the protocol, and then as a group trying to kind of like, let's understand where is it a misconception? Is there a prerequisite skill need? And so when you do that by standard and then looking by kids, you can start seeing what exactly is happening as opposed to kind of like group averages, which doesn't necessarily help you figure out what to do. So in School City, there's some breakdowns by standards. There's some individual reports that you can build up, but that's kind of, and then the only other thing is we have a report that looks at the things that we think are most essential. And it tells what the last School City assessment, what was the level of mastery that kid demonstrated. So if you see a kid that kind of blows out on a benchmark, but you can see that there's been 3 more formatives in that same area, and now they've moved up, you don't have to wait to figure out if the kid's on the right track or not. You can start seeing that movement happen.
Awesome. And because you have so many kids that are proficient, I assume, you have the challenge of having them show continuous growth.
Yeah.
How are you doing in that area?
It is always a challenge. I mean, I think what's interesting, my belief has started to move towards when you have kids that already know stuff, you have to be a little more like, what's that area of strength? What's that way of like getting them deeper into stuff? Because if you just give them more, it's sometimes they like, I don't want to demonstrate that I know more because then I'm just going to get more. And so we're really working on how do we kind of like understand like their strengths and their interest and try to build extensions and enrichments that are based more kind of in those unique areas of interest, as opposed to just dumping more work on them and then kind of disengaging them from demonstrating achievement.
Absolutely. Okay, last question. What do you use for writing? Because that's the biggest struggle. Kids can read, but the writing portion is, I want to talk to you. I'm gonna have to contact you.
And to be honest, what we're using, I'm not necessarily in love with. So,
Okay.
I really appreciate the functional phonics. We've definitely used Wilson as a strong remediation for kids that are kind of in tier 3 support. Writing is a work in progress. I can't say I love it.
Mm. Yeah,
But
that's a big
I
challenge.
share your concerns about writing and also the challenges about it.
Thank you so much. And congratulations again.
Thank you. I'll just echo the comments of the other members. Your time today and sharing your lessons learned and how it's led to success is really very helpful and very interesting. I have one question though. Since your model is focused a little bit differently than what we've heard from some of the other presentations today, and you mentioned about one of our earlier presenters with the barriers, the misconceptions, the disengagement. I'm wondering if we could talk just a little bit about what parent engagement looks like, where it's not so focused on how is it related to attendance? So I might not have transportation, or I have chronic illness, or other issues related to disengagement. Can you share a little bit about what parent engagement looks like? Because I would feel certain that you probably are doing an excellent job there as well.
It's an interesting question because so we do a lot of like, this is what kids are learning this week. This is what's happening. This is what support looks like. I can tell you one of the challenges we have is that if we have a student that has attendance issues and we try to provide like support or demonstrate concern about the attendance, it's not necessarily always well received. And I think that's why I kind of lean in the idea that some state work around the misconceptions about attendance might be helpful, because us letting someone know that there's some attendance issues, here's some supports they have, it doesn't necessarily, it's just, it doesn't land, or the parents don't feel like this is a support system. They sometimes get very defensive. And so I think those preventative things to get those out in the systems and developing some shared messaging statewide about why being in school is important and just missing 2 days a month adds up will help out, because then it's not like the teacher trying to make that message or the school. This is happening. We're all making we're all making this statement. This is important from everybody. And I don't know if other schools have that same issue or if it's a unique Tanque Verde thing, but it's one of those challenges when people are having challenges to how do you connect with them in a way that they hear and see opportunity to support and don't just feel like a need to be defensive. And it's like, we're not questioning or not challenging or assessing you. We're just trying to figure out how do you get back on track, and trying to find those pathways in the way to message that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Anne, you had a question.
Yes, it's a bit of a follow-up on the previous question. First of all, congratulations on your teaching and learning focus and student engagement focus. But given your weekly look at data, you're obviously taking a close look, I would imagine, at your chronically absent students. Are you seeing commonality across those students? And if so, how have you addressed it?
So that's, the reason I think that model of those 4 areas of support are important is I don't necessarily see, I don't know, it's not like we have a bunch of engagement issues or a bunch of aversion issues. I think it's a really kind of mishmash thing. And so I think that's why you need to kind of have like a menu of supports. So that's what I think is challenging. And I think if I was in a different place, I would be concerned of making assumptions that, people in this community have these kinds of barriers versus people in that community have this. I think people have all those 4 issues are happening with probably every community, and just building up different kind of menus to figure out. And it might be that one community has more these kinds of barriers than that, but to think that there's not engagement issues everywhere, there's not issues of relationships and aversion, there's issues of barriers and issues of misconception. So my kind of belief is that we need to work on all 4 of those things and build up supports in all those areas, and then figure out the right mix kind of student by student. It's sort of like this, it's like a little like recipe, a balancing act of kind of by kid.
Member Buttles.
I have a question that's kind of on the other side of this. As you have made these monumental growth gains and probably shifts in the way that you're operating. How are you increasing teacher buy-in? And with the movement from compliance to really looking at instruction and data, are you taking things off of teacher plates? Are you replacing them with something else? Can you talk to us about how you went in that direction, please?
So, like, I think that's a great question. And one of the things we did was at the very beginning, we really de-emphasized the benchmarks and all the things that in my normal world with the things I lean into, and tried to get people just to respond to the data in front of them and respond to the kids in front of them. And then initiative wise, the only initiative we have is we're working on being a professional learning community. So there's not like some other, like you wouldn't come to our website and see a bunch of other initiatives outside of what you're hearing about now. This is the only thing we do. This is how we operate. I think that kind of goes to how do we blend in the supports around barriers into this model as opposed to having a separate thing over here and a separate thing there. So so I think that is thinned out that. And then the other thing I think I talked about is the release days of giving teams release days per quarter and paid days during the summertime, so that we're trying to create time. And we also created at elementary level, everybody has common plans. And so you have common plans that kind of helps facilitate, so you don't have to meet outside of the day. There's never, if we ask you to kind of meet outside the day, it's an optional thing and it's paid. And so that's the other thing, is this like respecting people's time and making sure it's within the school day.
Thank you.
Director Ross.
Dr. Hagerman, and this might not be a question that for which there's data readily available, just maybe even anecdotally, have you all noticed any sort of correlation between as the district has effectively addressed its tier 1 instruction and you know, harnessed its focus, and that's also had a positive impact on chronic absenteeism, has it had an impact on teacher retention?
I mean, you definitely see both retention and then also people who are interested in being in our district because of they see what the work looks like, and it's like, hey, this is the things I always wanted to do, but I don't feel like I ever have time because there's so much initiative fatigue everywhere, or so many and so both we pull down to staff. When I look, we have a guiding coalitions at each school, which are like team leads and the principals looking at what's going on, learning and stuff. And then when I look at those agendas, I just, over the last 3 years, you just see the level of teacher ownership in the work. And so it definitely went from feeling kind of compliance oriented to like trying to being kind of clumsy with processes to like the staff just owns what they do. And it's not the district sets up processes, but doesn't dictate. I don't dictate what the essential standards are in 3rd grade. The teams decide together. And I think that, and then sometimes they'll make bad decisions and they'll look at their data at the end of the year and say, you know what, I don't think that's as essential as I thought it was. And just having that level of ground level ownership and not feeling like, here's the thing I have to do that's being dictated, and I don't think it really fits what I think is most important, but I have to do it anyways. It's a much more at the ground level, the people working with the kids, having processes to address what they see in front of them.
All right. Well, that is a wonderful way to end this section. And thank you again, Dr. Hagerman, for sharing your great model with us. We really appreciate the work that you do and your team does on behalf of kids in your community. We are going to shift now. And now that we've learned about chronic absenteeism nationally and at the state and locally, the subcommittee, we would like to have discussed the information and bring forth any questions or concerns the subcommittee may have. And I think we're going to allot about 20 minutes for discussion. So please let the discussion begin. Also, just observations, if you don't have any more questions, because we were asking questions all the way along, but we have some of our presenters still available. If there are continued questions or just observations, what struck you, what questions do you still maybe have, what further things might be warranted to explore? Okay, we'll go with Dr. Durden and then we'll go with Member Canto. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. The one thing that stood out to me was the messaging, and that the message about the importance of coming to school may be different for a high school parent versus a primary parent or kindergarten parent. And I think that's something we really want to think about, is how do we want to message that? Because there are so many misunderstandings out there. Like, I have a sniffle. Do I keep the child at home? You know, we've had changes since COVID, and I think a lot of parents and teachers are stuck with what we were told before. And they're out of respect. You know, I don't want to send my children to school and have them have an illness that's going to spread in the classroom. I think we need to think about how that messaging goes through, like through our health department, through our nurses. So I think Lori's presentation brought some really good points about that. I think that, again, there's just a lot of misconception that, well, it was okay then. Why do they have to come now? They did fine. We've heard parents say they did really well. They stayed home and they did good. Why do they have to come now? So I think that's something to consider.
And then I think what I was hearing as I reflect, particularly with Dr. Hagerman and Tinker Verde, sounds like a lot of building of teacher agency, which was probably what was really happening with the teachers taking the lead on the decision making. And then kind of to carry on with Dr. Durden's comment as well, I'm reflecting upon opportunities that I think exist certainly in our district, but I would imagine across the state, for partnerships that we really leveraged during the pandemic and did it very effectively, and perhaps too much so. I think that may have led to some of the misconceptions that we went from pandemic to endemic to where we are now. And we really worked with our health partners to talk about what it looked like to be out, how long you should be out, why you should be out. And we did that very well during COVID, but I don't think we flipped the script once we came out of the pandemic. And maybe that's something that explicit conversation needs to happen to clarify that for parents, for staff, for students at all levels. And I also think there were opportunities. I was talking with Member Sanchez that we have a pre-K, so we have equip meetings. It's kind of a mandate for those of us with pre-K. I don't think we're having the conversations perhaps that we could be having in those meetings. I certainly would not have thought to have a discussion with our Head Start or our preschool folks about attendance. And now I'm feeling kind of silly that wasn't a realization and something we talk about. We talk about what they do and how well they do it and how that's going to transition kids into our programs, but we weren't really talking about attendance. And so that was probably a missed opportunity that we can effectively have those transitions and understand that data, particularly because we were looking at data about preschool attendance prior to coming into school and looking at its effectiveness or the long lastingness with our First Things First partners. But I think we kind of missed the boat of one of those data pieces related to attendance that might have shined a little different light or helped us interpret that data. So just a lot of reflection that I think might help us as we move forward across our state and definitely in our district with looking at this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Canto. That's a great observation. I'll just piggyback on that. And I think one of the things that a number of our presenters talked about was just the integration of attendance into what you already have going on and really not thinking about it as a separate thing. And I think that's what you're talking about is what are the processes, systems, and implementation efforts that I already have going on, and how can attendance be integrated into that if everything from Move On Reading to early learning and beyond. I thought that was a great point. Dr. Shepherd.
Yeah, I was thinking, I do a lot of work around our integrated action plans. Those are our Title I plans that we do for the state every year. And I'm also part of we also have an ATSI grant for targeted assistance as well. And so I work a lot with subgroups in our district, but I've never considered chronic absentee kids as a subgroup. And so I wrote that down to take that back. We have to talk about not only our free and reduced lunch kids, our EL kids, our our ESS kids, but we have to talk about our absent kids. And it's going to have to be a fourth subgroup for us to monitor. So when you look out in your classroom, because Yuma's down on the border, so we have a lot of EL kids. We have to have a lot of ESS kids. It's unbelievable what's happening right now in that world. But then also now let's find out who's coming to school in a subgroup almost.
Could tag on that. I just do think it's a different lens when we're looking and using data, because we're so data rich, I think all of us. But when you're trying to interpret that data, if you aren't adding that other lens or subgroup, however you'd wish to call it, of chronic absenteeism, you may come up with the wrong problem. So it's kind of that fishbone or whatever you use, integrated action plan, school improvement kind of lens. As I'm asking why, absenteeism better be one of the questions that you're asking, because that really could be one of those factors or variables that's making something not it should be effective, but it's not, and that might be the reason it's not. That root cause.
I just wanted to share that I'm a bit concerned that we do not have legislation that addresses student mobility. That worried me. And from my previous district where I was working at, that was major. That was huge for us in that we had a highly transient student population, and it was very difficult for us to track, especially when they were moving from housing that was semi-permanent to permanent, and then having to help them with, if they wanted to stay within our school, having to work with the other district that was their home district and figuring out transportation. And what that led to a lot of times was entire families not coming to school on the same day, because maybe the older student that normally helped with making sure the littles got to school was out sick, and so forth. And so the entire family wouldn't come in. But that was something that came up during, I think it was Lori's presentation, that really caught my attention.
Anne.
I would just have a wondering about, because we heard across several of the presentations about this notion of misconception, and that feels like a state opportunity perhaps, but it strikes me that there are probably lots of people communicating to families. You've got the health department, you've got their physicians, you've got the emergency room, you've got health and human services, you've got local boards of education, you've got state boards of education. So just sort of thinking about the air traffic control of the communication around this and leading with the message of the importance of attendance as the tagline, and then getting into the clarity of a message. But it does strike me that there are lots of folks in the air traffic control communicating, and it would be very confusing if you were a parent/pilot trying to figure out who to listen to in order to get your kid to school, land your plane. So just invite the committee to think about that particular piece, since that was such a strong message around the many misconceptions coming out of COVID.
Thank you, Anne. Anyone online have any questions for us, or ponderings or things that stood out? Okay. Well, I think, Anne, your last comment is actually a nice segue into the next section of the agenda, which is that we would like to, this part of the agenda has been designed to have the subcommittee begin to think about eventual recommendations for the state board. One example would be the subcommittee can choose to support the recommendations of the Arizona Chronic Absenteeism Task Force that's discussed by Lori Masur to lend the board's support to this work. That work, as she mentioned, is being finalized after a year-long task force coming together, and will be finalized in August. And I am sure Lori would be happy to come back and share those final recommendations so that this subcommittee could consider those. That's one option. Anyone have any thoughts on that or discussion? And Director Ross? Anything?
No, go ahead, Chair Clark, and I'll have a comment after.
All right. Just putting that out there is seeing if there's any consensus that might be one thing that this subcommittee could recommend, is that we ask for those recommendations when they're final to come back to this group and for us to ponder them and in their final form and perhaps support them. Okay, I'm seeing some nodding heads. Awesome. All right. Any other anything else? Any other comments, or Director Russ, anything you'd like to add to that?
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the committee. No, I was just going to, since this is sort of the first time this committee is looking at ideas and the generation of ideas, just to clarify for the committee that, and it's a little different in maybe this chronic absenteeism space because it's so new for some of the folks, and it's actually why there was so much interest in that first meeting from Terry's slide on chronic absenteeism, and we picked up pretty quickly at like, oh, this group is really wants to learn more, so that's why we made this the first topic. But as the group moves forward and is tackling other topics related to early literacy, the goal of the subcommittee is to produce a list of recommendations that would then be taken to the state board for the board to vote on and consider. And I just wanted to lay out sort of what those recommendations, they can take three basic forms. The first form would be recommendations to the Department of Education on needed guidance on certain issues. And that can be like an increased focus, newly created guidance. To give an example, from the chronic absenteeism from today's topic, it could be something like, the having the department, Tiana oversees the English language arts team, having them create some guidance or training around the connection between chronic absenteeism and early literacy, and, or having it be a discussion point in their technical assistance for Move On When Reading, and that, so there are sort of pieces that'll take a guidance form. One of the other paths would be board rule. So for those who might be unfamiliar, the board is a policymaking body for education in the state and oversees the Arizona Administrative Code rules related to education. What that looks like quite often is statute will be passed, law will be passed in education, and statute is often either too vague or too specific. And so the board will come in and sort of establish rule around that, the implementation of that statute, to make it more implementable and to help sort of refine and define. The thing to understand about board rule is it cannot contradict statute. So it's really important to understand that it can augment statute, it can clarify, but it cannot contradict. And then the third option of a type of recommendation, and this is actually Tiana, what your comment sort of teed this up as well, is you all can make recommendations for suggestions to the legislature. The board does not have the ability to obviously pass laws on its own of it in any way, but we do have a very active role at the legislature during the session, and so are able to meet with legislators and share with them ideas that emerge from a subcommittee to see if there is interest in some sort of statute, either the creation of a new statute, change to an existing statute. So anyway, those are just to give you an overview of the kind of three paths ahead of you for recommendations. Again, guidance from the department, board rule, and then suggested changes in legislation. And so again, today's meeting is a little different because there is that task force working on the recommendations, and it sounds like the will of the committee will be to have those recommendations come back when they're fully finished, and you all could then review and sort of vote. But as we move forward, just to keep those three tracks in mind.
Thank you, Director Ross. And it's I think the recommendations coming out of the task force fall into those three buckets that you just described. So hopefully the members will see take a look at that and provide input in the final form. All right, we then I think can move to the next agenda item, and last is that the next meeting of this committee is on Thursday, June 13th at 9 a.m. And with that being said, I think that we will call this meeting adjourned at 11:28
Nice.
a.m.
Thank you, everybody. Especially thank you to those who drove. I know this was not an easy drive for Dwayne and Angel, but thank you so much.